Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the strange world of a 19th century man who was so desperate for a good night's sleep that he invented a sleeping mask to cure insomnia. Sounds like something straight out of a Victorian fever dream, doesn't it? You probably wouldn't last a night in those days. Imagine struggling to fall asleep while a steam-powered machine hums away next door, or worse, trying to sleep in a room filled with the sounds of an industrial revolution. But hey, we're not here to judge. Instead, let's ease into tonight's journey together and explore how the quest for sleep has been anything but peaceful. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the restless man at the center of this story, who, like so many others in the 19th century, was caught in a cycle of sleepless nights. He wasn't the first to toss and turn in search of slumber, but his solution was certainly among the most curious. You see, back in those days, insomnia was a real problem, and not just a case of "I had too much caffeine." The Industrial Revolution had kicked into high gear, and with it came the clamor of machinery and the rise of factory work, all of which disrupted the peace and quiet that once defined the night. The man we're talking about lived in an era when sleep was both a luxury and a challenge. In this bustling world of the 1800s, insomnia became something more than just a personal inconvenience. It was a topic of scientific and social interest. Sleep wasn't just a biological necessity. It was a mystery to be solved. People wondered, what causes sleeplessness, and how can it be fixed? Our restless man, struggling with these very questions, found himself obsessed with finding an answer. So he did what any self-respecting Victorian gentleman would do. He created a solution. Historians still argue whether this man's quest for sleep was part of a larger movement of strange medical inventions, or simply the result of his own sleep-deprived madness. Regardless, he would go down in history for attempting to cure his insomnia in a way that no one had before. This is where the sleeping mask comes in. As we drift deeper into the 19th century, it becomes clear that insomnia wasn't just a personal affliction, but a societal problem. The Victorians were obsessed with sleep, not just for its health benefits, but because it was tied to their very identity. In a world where class, work, and reputation mattered, sleep, or rather the lack of it, began to take on a more symbolic role. So, let's step into this world of Victorian society, where sleep was more than a biological necessity. It was a marker of social standing and a reflection of one's lifestyle. The Victorians, as you might imagine, had some very particular ideas about rest. For the wealthy, sleep was something to be savored, perhaps taken in a luxurious four-poster bed, with velvet drapes blocking out any hint of daylight. It wasn't just about physical rest, but about a peaceful, undisturbed escape from the pressures of daily life. To sleep well was to show that one had the leisure to relax. If you had the time to sleep soundly for 8 hours, it was a sign of your privileged position in society. For the working class, on the other hand, sleep was often seen as a luxury they didn't have the time to indulge in. They slept when they could, often in crowded, noisy conditions, after long hours of labor. But it wasn't just the rich and poor who had differing views on sleep. The very idea of what sleep was supposed to represent was in flux. Sleep wasn't always about quiet rest. It was often tied to cultural practices and even moral codes. For example, sleep was sometimes associated with laziness, particularly for those who were able to sleep in past dawn, which was considered a form of indulgence. This perspective was deeply embedded in the Victorian work ethic, where the ideal was to rise early and get to work without delay. However, there was also a growing fascination with the idea of rest as a rejuvenation of the spirit, leading to the rise of sleep treatments and remedies designed to help people find a more restorative kind of rest. The concept of sleep itself became more medicalized during this time. Doctors and scientists, eager to unlock the mysteries of the human body, began exploring sleep in ways they hadn't before. In fact, the term insomnia was first introduced during this period, and it quickly became a buzzword. Sleeplessness wasn't just seen as a temporary nuisance anymore. It was becoming a serious condition that needed to be addressed. Historians still debate whether the rise of insomnia treatments in the 19th century was a result of genuine concern for public health or whether it was simply a product of an overactive medical imagination. But one thing is clear. This period saw an explosion of creative and often bizarre solutions for the problem of sleep. This is where our man's invention of the sleeping mask comes into play, and where his story intersects with the medical obsession of his time. By now, you might be wondering, what exactly made the 19th century so ripe for insomnia-induced innovation? Well, the answer lies in the growing intersection of science, medicine, and the increasing pressures of modern life. While sleep had always been recognized as essential, the 1800s marked a pivotal moment in how it was perceived and studied. Sleep wasn't just for the aristocracy anymore. It was becoming a concern for the working class, the professionals, and even the burgeoning middle class. Everyone wanted more of it, and more importantly, they wanted better sleep. But here's the twist. Sleep science in the 1800s was, shall we say, underdeveloped. It was an era when medical treatments could range from scientifically plausible to outright quackery. Yet, at the same time, it was a period of extraordinary curiosity about the human body and mind. So, you'd have scientists carefully studying the effects of sleep deprivation and insomniac patterns, while also having eccentric doctors promoting miracle cures for sleeplessness. Picture this. A person suffering from insomnia might have been prescribed a cocktail of opium, herbal tea, and perhaps a little electric shock therapy. If that didn't work, well, there was always the possibility of sleeping under the guidance of a doctor who had dubious methods of diagnosis, methods that sometimes involved looking into a patient's eyes or taking their pulse while muttering strange incantations. It's safe to say that the study of sleep was still in its infancy during the 19th century. While today we have advanced sleep studies and knowledge about sleep cycles, back then, doctors weren't exactly sure what was happening while you slept. They understood the need for sleep, of course, but they didn't have a clear grasp on what was happening during those long, blissful hours of unconsciousness. As a result, many treatments were experimental at best and bizarre at worst. This brings us back to our 19th century man, the one who would give birth to the infamous sleeping mask. Unlike today's sleep experts, who have a vast array of sleep aids, pills, masks, apps, white noise machines, this man believed that the key to curing insomnia lay in something far more practical: keeping the sleeper in the dark. Well, too dark, as it turns out. He envisioned a mask, a device that would cover the eyes, shield the mind from intrusive thoughts, and induce the necessary environment for rest. Sounds simple, right? But in his time, the idea was nothing short of revolutionary. Historians still argue whether his invention was truly an attempt at modern sleep therapy, or simply the product of a man's sleep-deprived desperation. But whatever the case, his invention spoke to a broader cultural shift in how sleep was viewed. Sleep wasn't just a luxury anymore. It was something that could be controlled, regulated, and even prescribed. In the broader context of 19th century medical thought, the sleeping mask wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a growing trend of self-improvement and self-care. People were learning to take control of their own health, whether it was through sleep, diet, or exercise. And though his mask didn't catch on as a mainstream cure for insomnia, it represented a significant moment in the medicalization of rest. So, here we are, with the curious invention of the sleeping mask. If you're picturing something akin to modern-day sleep masks that promise to block out the light and help you fall asleep, you're not entirely wrong. But there was more to this mask than just blocking light. This 19th century creation was meant to be an instrument of total sensory deprivation. Think of it as an early attempt at creating the perfect environment for sleep, but perhaps with a bit too much ambition. Rather than simply shading the eyes, the mask aimed to isolate the wearer from the outside world entirely. It wasn't just the light it blocked, but the world's noise, its chaos, its everything. A bit dramatic, right? But then again, so was everything in the 1800s. This sleeping mask, as it turns out, was not just a piece of cloth sewn together with a dash of Victorian flair. No, it had a distinctly scientific, almost experimental edge to it. The man who invented it wasn't your typical sleep expert of the time, and he wasn't a doctor or a psychologist. He was an ordinary man, but one with a relentless curiosity and a serious sleep problem. This guy's frustration with sleepless nights led him to seek answers where few had thought to look. Imagine him, perhaps a mild-mannered gentleman, sitting up late in his study, surrounded by books filled with the latest scientific discoveries of the time. He's leafing through pages about the wonders of sleep, about the mind's need for peace, when it suddenly hits him. Maybe what he needs isn't more sleep aids or sedatives, but a way to shut everything out. And so, the mask was born. The mask's design was simple in concept. A tight-fitting cover for the eyes, with the idea that the less the mind was stimulated, the more likely the body would drift into peaceful slumber. It wasn't just about blocking light. It was about blocking the world. The mask was, in a way, a symbol of the era's growing obsession with controlling all aspects of life, including the very act of sleeping. The Victorian era was one of rapid progress and immense change. New scientific discoveries were being made every day, and the world was becoming more and more modernized. But along with this progress came an increasing sense of chaos. People needed a way to control their bodies and minds amidst the clamor of industrialization. Historians still wonder whether the sleeping mask was a precursor to the modern-day methods of sleep therapy, or just a strange curiosity of a single restless man. Some say the mask was an early form of sleep psychology, while others claim it was merely a quirky response to the overwhelming pressures of the time. Either way, the sleeping mask was indicative of something deeper, a society grappling with how to rest in an increasingly noisy world. But as with most innovations in history, the sleeping mask didn't become a widespread success. It didn't get adopted by the masses, despite its revolutionary potential. Why? Well, as much as this mask might have sounded like the perfect solution for insomnia, there were just too many hurdles to overcome. The design itself, while visionary, was impractical. Imagine trying to sleep in a mask that left you with no sensory input whatsoever. No light, no sound, nothing. It wasn't so much a sleep aid as it was an elaborate form of isolation. And in the end, most people preferred their sleep with a bit more connection to the world. Still, the sleeping mask remained a curious blip in the history of sleep innovation. It may not have been the miracle cure it was hoped to be, but it's a fascinating glimpse into the desperate lengths people will go to for rest. It tells us something about the human desire to control not just our wakefulness, but also our unconsciousness. Now let's step back for a moment and think about the broader medical climate of the 19th century. This was a time when science was still figuring itself out, much like a person stumbling around in the dark, trying to find the light switch. Yes, there were advances, tremendous ones in fact, but there were also plenty of moments when the medical field was more about trial and error than solid answers. And when it came to insomnia, it wasn't just about using a sleeping mask or fancy remedies. It was a time when medicine itself could be downright strange. Medical treatments back then were a hodgepodge of the curious and the practical. Doctors, in their attempt to understand the human body, would prescribe anything from herbal concoctions to bleeding. Yes, actual bleeding, to try and balance the body's humors. Insomnia, as you can imagine, was no different. It wasn't just about sitting back and reading the latest sleep studies. It was about offering up odd remedies and hoping something worked. Take opium, for example. The drug was a common sleep aid in the 19th century, not only for pain relief, but also for its sedative effects. Doctors would often prescribe it for insomnia, without much thought about the long-term effects. The fact that opium was also highly addictive didn't seem to faze anyone at the time. It was just part of the medical toolbox. But in the case of our sleep-deprived inventor, he might have thought that opium was a bit too harsh. His solution, the sleeping mask, was a more controlled, more humane way of trying to conquer insomnia. He wasn't looking for a quick fix like opium or laudanum. He wanted something that would provide long-term relief. His mask was an attempt to create a sleep environment so ideal, so perfect, that it could make insomnia a thing of the past. At the same time, there were plenty of other innovations in the medical field that bordered on the bizarre. One of the more curious sleep treatments came in the form of electric currents. Yes, early forms of electric shock therapy were used as a treatment for various ailments, including sleep disorders. Doctors believed that applying electricity to the body could restore balance and cure a number of conditions, including sleeplessness. While the idea of using electricity to promote sleep might sound absurd now, it was part of a growing belief in the power of science to solve all of life's problems, no matter how weird the solution seemed. Historians still debate whether the sleeping mask was an ingenious solution or just another quack remedy lost to time. Some argue that it was a precursor to modern sleep aids, a way of creating the perfect environment for rest. Others see it as nothing more than a quirky invention of a man who was desperately searching for a way to sleep in a noisy, rapidly changing world. What's interesting about this period is how it reflects society's growing concern with mental health, particularly the effects of stress and fatigue. In the 19th century, people were starting to realize that the pressures of modern life could take a toll on their physical well-being. The idea that sleep could be disrupted by external factors like noise or stress was beginning to gain traction. But rather than addressing the root causes of insomnia, like industrialization or societal expectations, people instead turned to quick fixes like the sleeping mask. Of course, today, we know that insomnia is more complex than just finding a way to block out the world. Sleep is influenced by a variety of factors, from mental health to lifestyle choices. But in the 1800s, the sleeping mask represented a kind of hopeful optimism, a belief that if we just shut everything out, we could finally achieve that elusive, restful night's sleep. As we continued this journey through 19th century sleep, we find ourselves surrounded by a backdrop of eclectic remedies and peculiar solutions. Let's step outside the confines of the medical world for a moment and look at the broader cultural context in which these strange sleep cures emerged. You see, sleep wasn't just an individual concern in the 1800s. It was a societal issue, and it tied into the rapidly changing world. Life was becoming faster, noisier, and more crowded, which, unsurprisingly, made it harder to rest. The Victorian era, with all its grandeur and progress, was also a time of overwhelming industrialization, and with that came a new kind of stress that wasn't present in quieter times. Imagine, for a moment, the sights and sounds of an industrial city in the 19th century. There's the constant hum of factory machines, the clang of metal against metal, and the ever-present rush of people trying to make a living. In many ways, it was a time of progress. Yes, but it was also a time of fatigue. The pressures of modern life were beginning to weigh heavily on the population, and people didn't just want to sleep to feel rested. They needed to sleep to escape the chaos around them. But the more society progressed, the more the simple act of sleep seemed to slip further out of reach. And so, sleep began to take on new meaning. It wasn't just a way to rejuvenate for another day of hard work. It became a symbol of the kind of control people wished they could have over their lives. If they could control their sleep, they could perhaps control the chaotic world they lived in. The sleeping mask, in its odd way, was a response to this very desire. It wasn't just about blocking out light. It was about creating a controlled, isolated space where the individual could escape the external noise of the world. In the 1800s, sleep was considered more of an art than a science. Sure, we had the beginnings of sleep studies, but the understanding of sleep patterns, circadian rhythms, and the role of dreams in our well-being was rudimentary at best. This lack of scientific knowledge meant that sleep treatments often veered into the realm of the absurd. Aside from the sleeping mask, other treatments included things like placing cool compresses on the forehead, consuming vast quantities of herbal teas, or even undergoing what today seems like an early form of stress relief through methods like hypnosis or electric shocks. One particularly curious treatment was sleeping potions. These concoctions, made from various herbs, were meant to induce a restful slumber. Some of the more popular ingredients included chamomile, lavender, and valerian root, herbs that are still used in modern sleep aids today. However, some potions were a little more dubious, like restorative tonics, that included everything from alcohol to opium. While many of these treatments had legitimate calming effects, others were more about keeping the patient docile during the night than actually helping them sleep. And, of course, not all of them were exactly safe. Historians still debate the extent to which the medical community in the 1800s understood the complex nature of sleep. Some suggest that doctors were simply doing the best they could with the limited tools they had, while others argue that the solutions they proposed often exacerbated the very problems they were trying to solve. In the case of the sleeping mask, there was a hope that creating the ideal environment, complete sensory isolation, might help ease the mind and body into rest. But as we've seen, the practicality of the mask didn't quite live up to its promise. This cultural landscape of Victorian sleep treatments shows just how eager people were to solve their sleep problems. They sought solutions in all corners of life: medicine, science, and even folklore. While today we might roll our eyes at the idea of a sleeping mask or laugh at the thought of a sleeping potion, these remedies were part of a larger societal conversation about health and well-being. They were an attempt to wrestle control from the noisy, chaotic world of industrial progress and regain some semblance of peace. Despite its good intentions, the sleeping mask didn't quite revolutionize the way we sleep. Instead, it faded into history as just one of many strange, fleeting attempts to cure insomnia during the 19th century. And yet, despite its ultimate failure, it holds a peculiar place in the story of sleep and its complicated relationship with science and society. But let's take a moment to look more closely at the mask itself, how it was supposed to work, what it was meant to achieve, and why it ultimately didn't become the sleep solution that many had hoped for. The design of the sleeping mask was fairly straightforward in its concept. It covered the eyes and blocked out all light, ensuring a completely dark environment. But beyond this basic function, the mask was meant to offer something more, an almost meditative isolation. Picture yourself wearing the mask. Everything around you is muted, silent. There's no visual stimulation to distract you, no light to confuse your brain into thinking it's time to wake up. The world outside is shut out completely. For someone suffering from insomnia, this kind of sensory deprivation must have seemed like the perfect solution, a way to remove all the noise and chaos of the world and finally get a good night's sleep. But here's the catch. The mask didn't work as expected. The more practical problems of wearing such an object overnight quickly became apparent. For one, it wasn't particularly comfortable. The mask was often tight, sometimes to the point of feeling suffocating, and it wasn't designed to allow the wearer to shift positions in bed comfortably. Imagine trying to sleep with something restricting your movement, forcing you to stay in one position all night. It's not exactly conducive to a peaceful slumber. For some, the very act of wearing the mask, isolating oneself from the outside world, could have been more anxiety-inducing than calming. But the real issue was that the mask was too extreme in its attempt to create the perfect sleep environment. Sleep is a delicate balance. While blocking out light and noise can certainly help, it's not just about creating total isolation. In fact, modern sleep science has shown us that some people actually need gentle sound or light to fall asleep. White noise machines, for example, are popular today precisely because they provide a soft, steady background hum that drowns out more disruptive sounds. By completely cutting the wearer off from the outside world, the mask might have inadvertently made the experience of trying to fall asleep more unnerving than relaxing. Historians still argue whether the sleeping mask was too ahead of its time or simply a quirky failure that belonged to a bygone era of medical trial and error. Perhaps the mask was an early attempt to achieve the same results that we now know can be done with modern sleep aids, like blackout curtains or sleep trackers. Today, we understand that sleep is more than just a matter of blocking out external stimuli. It's about creating the right environment that supports the natural rhythms of our bodies. In the 1800s, however, this idea was still in its infancy, and the sleeping mask's rigid approach to isolation didn't account for the complexities of how sleep actually works. Despite its shortcomings, the mask was a reflection of the time's medical and cultural attitudes towards sleep. It shows that the Victorians were trying, albeit in sometimes odd ways, to understand and control a process as fundamental as rest. The mask was also symbolic of a larger trend in the 19th century, where medical solutions were often rooted in experimentation rather than evidence. While modern sleep studies and treatments are grounded in science and data, the 1800s were still a time of wild speculation about how the body functioned. Treatments like the sleeping mask were not just about finding a cure for insomnia. They were about exploring new ways to understand and master the human body. In the end, the sleeping mask was one of many failed remedies in the long history of attempts to fix what wasn't fully understood. It's not that the mask was entirely without merit. It was an interesting, forward-thinking idea that sought to create the ideal conditions for sleep. But like many of the era's medical fads, it was a reminder of how far we've come in our understanding of what makes for a good night's rest. While the sleeping mask may have faltered in its quest to cure insomnia, it's important to remember that its failure didn't signal the end of the search for better sleep in the 19th century. In fact, it was just one chapter in a much broader and ongoing exploration of how to improve rest and alleviate sleeplessness.
While the sleeping mask may have faltered in its quest to cure insomnia, it's important to remember that its failure didn't signal the end of the search for better sleep in the 19th century. In fact, it was just one chapter in a much broader and ongoing exploration of how to improve rest and alleviate sleeplessness. By the time the mask was being tinkered with, the 1800s were already ripe with sleep-related innovations. This was the age of great change, not just in technology and industry, but also in medicine and social norms. As society became more industrialized, sleep and its many disruptions began to be viewed not just as a personal problem, but as a public health issue. The quest for better sleep was driven by the increasing recognition of how important sleep was to productivity and health. Sleep wasn't just something people did at the end of a long day. It became a matter of how to optimize your rest so you could perform better, work harder, and be more efficient. Of course, this was the Victorian work ethic at play. After all, you couldn't possibly achieve all that society demanded of you without a good night's sleep, right? But with the advent of new industries, factories, and technology came a new kind of urban life, noisy, bustling, and ever awake. The result was that more and more people were struggling to get the kind of sleep they needed to function at their best. People, particularly in the lower classes, often worked long hours, only to return to overcrowded, noisy homes where sleep wasn't exactly easy to come by. In response to these issues, we start to see a rise in sleep aids and remedies. But unlike the sleeping mask, which sought to isolate the sleeper from the outside world entirely, many of these solutions aim to make the sleeping process as comfortable and soothing as possible. Some were far more practical than others, while others ventured into the realm of the bizarre. For instance, it wasn't uncommon to find people seeking out opium-based tinctures or herbal teas that promised to calm the nerves and send them into a peaceful slumber. Other remedies included poultices of lavender, a plant widely believed to promote relaxation, or warm baths before bedtime. Perhaps the most notable of these treatments was the rise of sleep-inducing devices and gadgets, many of which were designed to create a calming atmosphere conducive to sleep. From weighted blankets to pillow systems, people were experimenting with ways to improve the quality of their rest. Though these inventions didn't always work, they represented the era's growing focus on sleep as a matter of both personal and public interest. One fascinating sleep aid of the time was the sleeping chair, a sort of reclining lounge designed to cradle the Raustrauer into a restful position. It wasn't just about lying down. Oh no, it was about achieving the perfect position for sleep, one that encouraged your body to relax fully and peacefully. You might imagine this as a Victorian version of the modern-day sleep recliner. These chairs were advertised as the perfect solution for those who struggle to sleep in their beds, either due to insomnia or the discomfort of poor sleeping conditions. Though some of these chairs were little more than an elegant gimmick, others were remarkably advanced for their time. Historians still argue whether the Victorian obsession with sleep and its various treatments were simply a reflection of the stress and chaos of their rapidly changing world, or if they were indicative of a deeper societal anxiety about rest and health. In any case, the sleeping mask, like many of the other treatments of the time, was a symbol of a world trying to make sense of itself in the face of growing industrialization. The mask might not have caught on, but it paved the way for the broader conversation about sleep that would continue well into the 20th century. As the 19th century came to a close, the relationship between sleep and health continued to evolve. People became more aware of the importance of rest, and the idea of a good night's sleep began to take on a new cultural significance. But the lessons of the sleeping mask, its attempt to control and perfect sleep, remained an important reminder of how far people were willing to go in their search for rest. As we look back at the 19th century, it becomes clear that the period marked a significant turning point in how sleep was perceived and treated. The sleeping mask was just one of many odd, inventive solutions that emerged in an age where the line between science and quackery was often blurred. But beyond the peculiarities of the mask and its brief moment in the spotlight, there's a larger question to ask. How did the 19th century Industrial Revolution affect the way people slept? And how did it lead to some of the sleep-related practices and innovations we still encounter today? The Industrial Revolution was not only an era of technological advancement, but also one of profound societal change. The factories, the steam engines, the endless noise, they all had an impact on the lives of those who lived and worked within this rapidly growing world. The 19th century was an age of immense productivity and constant movement, but it was also an age of growing exhaustion. As factory workers and urban dwellers spent long hours in factories or cramped homes, sleep became increasingly elusive. The more society advanced, the less time people seemed to have for rest, and the more difficult it became to sleep peacefully. Think about it. During this time, entire industries were booming: railroads, textiles, coal mining, and they were all producing an incessant hum of noise and activity. People in urban centers were no longer surrounded by the stillness of rural life. Instead, they were enveloped in the noise of machines, the clatter of streetcars, the constant chatter of city life. In fact, the concept of noise pollution didn't exist as we know it today, but it was clearly present in the lives of people working in these new industrial environments. Historians still debate whether the Industrial Revolution exacerbated the sleep problems of the era, or whether people simply became more aware of the need for rest as they worked longer and harder hours. What is certain, however, is that sleep became a luxury for those who could afford it, and a rare commodity for the working class. It's no wonder, then, that the Victorian obsession with perfecting sleep took hold. People wanted to escape the clamor of the world around them, and many turned to both the medical and cultural innovations of the time to help them achieve that elusive peace. The sleeping mask, while ultimately unsuccessful, reflected a growing awareness of the importance of rest in an increasingly noisy and stressful world. And even though the mask wasn't adopted on a large scale, the broader trends of the time did pave the way for future advancements in sleep medicine. The late 19th century saw the rise of new technologies and treatments aimed at improving sleep, including the beginnings of what we might now consider sleep hygiene practices. simple preventative measures that helped people prepare for a good night's rest. These practices might seem basic to us today, but back then they were part of an ongoing, evolving understanding of how the body and mind work together to achieve healthy sleep. Yet, even as the conversation around sleep became more sophisticated, the same cultural anxieties about sleep and work persisted. People continued to view sleep as a necessary escape from the pressures of their daily lives, and the desire to sleep better or more reflected a deeper cultural need to regain control over a world that was becoming faster, louder, and more overwhelming. The quest for rest was part of a broader struggle for balance in an industrializing world. People wanted to sleep, yes, but they also wanted to wake up and be able to take on the world with renewed energy. The more we examine the 19th century, the clearer it becomes that the Industrial Revolution did not just change how people worked, it changed how they slept, how they valued rest, and how they sought relief from the exhaustion that came with a rapidly modernizing world. While the sleeping mask itself was an interesting, if failed, attempt to achieve better sleep, it was part of a much larger movement toward understanding rest as something vital to human well-being. People were no longer content to simply sleep when they could. They wanted to sleep better, sleep more deeply, and sleep without the constant disruptions that marked the industrial age. By the time we move into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the question of how to achieve good sleep had evolved significantly. The Industrial Revolution had already caused major shifts in the way people lived, worked, and rested. While it was true that more and more people were struggling with the effects of sleep deprivation due to long working hours and noisy urban environments, it was also the dawn of a new era where sleep was beginning to be studied in earnest. People were starting to ask, what happens to us when we sleep? And how can we ensure we're getting the rest we need to live healthy, productive lives? These questions would eventually lead to the modern sleep science we know today. But before we dive into the modern era, let's take a moment to reflect on the many people throughout history who have struggled with sleep. Sleep disorders have existed as long as people have, whether it's insomnia, sleep apnea, or other disruptions in the natural sleep cycle. And in the 1800s, however, there was very little understanding of these conditions. It wasn't unusual for people to be told to simply rest more or to try some form of herbal tea or sedative to aid in their sleep. Some might have been prescribed the very same remedies that our restless man with the sleeping mask would have tried: opium, lavender, or calming potions made from a variety of mysterious plants. But one thing was clear. The 19th century was a time of exploration and experimentation, particularly when it came to health. It was a time when treatments for all sorts of ailments were being introduced and tested, with some working, some failing, and others simply fading into obscurity. The sleeping mask, despite its failure, stood out as a bold, creative attempt to address the growing issue of sleep deprivation. And though it didn't succeed, it captured the imagination of those who longed for rest in a rapidly changing world. Interestingly, the growing fascination with sleep during this time can be linked to the cultural and intellectual climate of the Victorian era. Intellectuals, philosophers, and writers were increasingly intrigued by the concept of the subconscious mind. Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and other pioneers of psychology were beginning to explore the role of dreams and unconscious processes, all of which would eventually have a profound impact on how we understood sleep. While Freud's theories were still in their infancy during the late 1800s, his later work on the unconscious mind would be deeply influenced by the growing interest in sleep and its connection to our mental health. Historians still argue whether sleep research during the 1800s was based more on trial and error than on a real understanding of sleep's mechanisms. After all, these were the same doctors who thought that bleeding patients or prescribing dangerous amounts of opium might cure a variety of ailments, including insomnia. But as the century turned, the push for more scientific evidence-based approaches to sleep and health began to gain momentum. Doctors were no longer content with vague theories. They wanted data. They wanted studies. They wanted proof that their sleep remedies actually worked. It's this growing focus on sleep as a science that set the stage for the advances in sleep medicine that would emerge in the 20th century. Even though the sleeping mask didn't achieve the success its inventor had hoped for, it contributed to a larger cultural understanding of sleep as something that could be manipulated, controlled, and studied. Today, we take for granted the idea that sleep is crucial to our physical and mental health. We have an entire field of medicine dedicated to sleep disorders, and countless products designed to help us rest better. But the 19th century's experiments with sleep, however misguided, were foundational to the development of modern sleep science. These early attempts, some of them bizarre, some of them strangely visionary, laid the groundwork for our understanding of sleep's critical role in our well-being. As we move closer to the modern age, we can see that the story of the sleeping mask is not just a quirky footnote in medical history. It's a symbol of humanity's constant search for better sleep and ultimately a better life. In many ways, the sleeping mask is a reminder of how far we've come in understanding rest and health. And perhaps more importantly, it's a reminder of how, even when our first attempts don't succeed, the search for knowledge never truly stops. As we look toward the 20th century, the evolution of sleep treatment takes an exciting turn. The era that followed the 19th century was one of rapid scientific progress, and with it came the kind of sleep research and understanding that would make the sleeping mask seem like a quaint relic of the past. It wasn't just that people had more advanced tools or technology at their disposal. There was a fundamental shift in how sleep was viewed. Instead of being seen as a simple, often disregarded part of daily life, sleep was now understood as a critical component of overall health and well-being. But how did this shift happen? The early 1900s marked the beginning of a new scientific era. Researchers began to ask the right questions about sleep, moving away from the vague and sometimes mystical ideas that had persisted in the 1800s. They wanted to understand not only why we sleep, but also how we sleep. What happens in the brain when we rest? Why do we dream? What are the biological rhythms that govern our sleep cycles? And importantly, how can we ensure that we get the best sleep possible? As the 20th century unfolded, sleep was no longer just a societal concern. It was a biological one. The 1900s saw the advent of the first modern sleep studies, many of which were conducted in sleep laboratories, where patients were monitored as they slept to track brain waves, heart rates, and other physiological responses. These studies began to uncover the intricate stages of sleep, including the discovery of REM, rapid eye movement, sleep in the 1950s. Suddenly, sleep wasn't just something we did. It was a vital, complex process with enormous implications for our health. Historians still debate the exact moment when sleep moved from the margins of medical science to the center stage. But there's no denying the importance of these early sleep studies in shaping the future of sleep research. The sleeping mask, as quirky and ineffective as it was, represented an early attempt to control and perfect sleep. Its failure didn't discourage progress. Instead, it served as one of many steps toward a more sophisticated understanding of the sleep process. Now, when we talk about sleep, we don't just talk about how to sleep or when to sleep. We talk about how to sleep well. Modern sleep science has shown us that sleep isn't just about rest. It's about quality. The way we sleep has a direct impact on our physical and mental health, affecting everything from cognitive function to immune response. We know today that sleep disorders like insomnia, sleep apnea, and restless leg syndrome can have long-term effects on our well-being. And we now have a vast array of tools to diagnose and treat these conditions. The sleeping mask might have been a misguided solution to the problem of insomnia, but its existence marks an important moment in the story of how we've come to understand sleep. It serves as a reminder of how far we've come in our efforts to improve the way we rest. It may not have worked as intended, but it was an idea that spoke to a larger cultural concern about rest and recuperation in a rapidly industrializing world. And in the end, it wasn't the mask that succeeded. It was the shift in thinking that came with it. As we look at the modern world, it's clear that the 19th century obsession with sleep has evolved into something far more nuanced and scientifically rigorous. Today we have sleep studies, therapies, medications, and devices, all designed to help us sleep better. While the sleeping mask was a step in the right direction, we've since learned that creating the perfect sleep environment isn't about total isolation or shutting out the world entirely. It's about understanding the delicate balance between our biological needs, our environment, and our mental health. Historians and sleep experts alike will continue to look back at these early treatments with a sense of amusement and curiosity. The sleeping mask might not have solved insomnia, but it set the stage for a future where sleep is understood as a complex and critical part of human health. As we continue to explore the mysteries of sleep, it's important to remember that even the most bizarre, seemingly ineffective ideas can contribute to the greater picture of our well-being. And who knows, perhaps in another century, we'll look back at our current sleep solutions and laugh, just as we now chuckle at the idea of a sleeping mask. As the 20th century marched forward, sleep became less of a mystery and more of a scientific frontier. The quest for the perfect night's rest continued, but by now, sleep was being treated like an intricate puzzle, one that researchers and doctors were eager to solve. Gone were the days of crude remedies and mystical treatments. The focus was shifting toward evidence-based science. But that didn't mean sleep was suddenly easy to understand. No, not by a long shot. In fact, it was during the early 1900s that the complexity of sleep really began to show itself. The discovery of the different stages of sleep, including the crucial REM, the rapid eye movement phase, was one of the most significant breakthroughs in sleep science. Before this, sleep was viewed as a simple, monolithic state. A person either slept or didn't. But once scientists began studying the brainwaves of sleepers, they discovered that sleep was a far more dynamic and multi-layered experience than anyone had imagined. REM sleep, where dreaming occurs, was found to be a crucial part of the sleep cycle. It turns out that our brains don't just rest during sleep. They continue to process information, consolidate memories, and work through emotions. And of course, it was discovered that a lack of REM sleep had far-reaching consequences on mental and physical health. Alongside the discovery of REM sleep, the sleep cycle itself began to be better understood. It was now known that humans experience multiple cycles of sleep during a night, each lasting about 90 minutes and alternating between REM and non-REM stages. This discovery began to shape how we think about sleep hygiene and health.